Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Lately we've been spending a lot of time chatting about septum stretching. Stretching with round pieces, stretching with stacking, how to stretch, all my best tips for it. So today we're kind of continuing that series by weighing the pros and cons between both methods of stretching. Now if you're curious about how to stretch your septum or how to stack your septum, I have two separate videos I've already posted about both those subjects that go into how to do it. Today's focus is really going to be the differences between those two stretching styles and kind of which one might be the better bet for you. So to start off, let's talk about the shape. So when we're talking about stretching with a round piece versus stretching with stacking, one of the biggest differences to really consider is the shape that it stretches. When we're stretching with a singular round piece, we're making one big round stretched piercing channel. This is perfect for wearing big chunky pieces like big circulars and captives, for wearing nice long tusks. There's a lot of fun jewelry that comes with this. When we're thinking about stretching by stacking, we're almost creating kind of like a coin slot shape. We're creating a long, narrow opening in the nose. This is not going to be super great if you want to wear a big chunky captive or a septum tusk. But if your goal is wearing a lot of small rings, this is going to be perfect because it's going to allow all the rings to sit nice and flat in line with each other. Conversely, when we look at stretching with a round piece, the rings, sure, there'll be a few that you can get to sit and lay really nicely, but past like 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6, depending on how big your stretch septum is, they're gonna start to like overlap over each other in your stretch septum, and they may not lay the way you want them to or in a way that you find aesthetically pleasing. Now, if you have stretched with a round piece, you could get like a custom-made piece of jewelry that has the look of a stacked ring, but the wearable itself is a singular large piece. That is an option as well. Normally, pieces like that are going to be quite a bit more expensive though. They're almost always going to be done in gold. Every now and again, I see someone get something custom in titanium, but they're still very pricey. And for a lot of folks who prefer the look of stacking and how nicely all of those rings lay, they're gonna wanna stretch by stacking so they can get that nice arrangement and nice lay of rings. But if you prefer the look of those big pieces, obviously stretching with round pieces is gonna be the way to go. And that kind of leads us into the second thing to think about when we're stretching our septum, which is what our jewelry goals are. Before you commit to one style of stretching over the other, I would really take a look at a lot of pictures online. Look at a bunch of different stacks, see what you like, what you don't like. Look at what people are wearing in solid pieces. Do you like the look of big circulars, big chunky pieces? Do you like the look of big chunky pinchers? Do you like some of the tusks or like the different pincher shapes and styles? What jewelry are you gravitating towards? What's your goal that you really want to wear in your septum? How you choose to stretch can really be informed by your jewelry goal. For me, I opted for stretching via stacking because of a number of different reasons, but primarily because I preferred the look of the stacks over the look of the large pieces. I really liked just the aesthetic of all of these clusters of rings, and I liked that I could change it up and do different decorative rings and match the rest of my facial jewelry sets with it. So that's what worked for me. That might not be the case for you. So again, really take the time and see what you're feeling, what your aesthetic is, what jewelry you want to go for. Now, probably one of the biggest factors to consider, and also kind of the like boring responsible one, is each method of stretching has some different things that go along with it. When we're stretching with round pieces, we can encounter things like denting and drooping quite a bit easier than we can when we're stretching by stacking. If you haven't watched my septum stretching video, watch that one because that has a lot of good information that relates to this video. But septum denting is when you're stretching and you begin to stretch in towards that hard structural cartilage, that septal cartilage that's further back in your nose. And there's really no way around it. If you're out of room in your nose and you're going pretty big, you're just gonna end up denting and eroding that cartilage, and that can be pretty miserable for a lot of people. The other thing you can encounter is septum droop. That's when the shape of your nose kind of changes as you're stretching and enlarging your septum. You kind of get that droop down from the side. Sometimes your nose begins to look wider and flatter from the front because of how the jewelry sits. It changes the shape of your nose. For some people, that change is amazing. They like the look of it. That's what they're after. Cool, awesome. Stretch with round pieces. You're gonna love it. But for other people, that is not the aesthetic they desire. They don't want their nose to change shape from the stretching process, or they're simply not a fan of how a septum looks with septum droop or some of those changes. If that's something that you might not be comfortable with or you might not want to deal with, consider stretching by stacking instead. Because stacking is going to create this elongated shape down the length of your nose, it's not very likely that it's going to cause enough of a change to how your nose sits to create that septum droop effect. And because stacking creates a long but narrow channel, it's really unlikely for you to deal with denting during it. Sometimes if you stack really large towards your last couple of sizes, either towards the back or towards the top corner, you'll encounter a little bit of denting, but it's usually not nearly what it is when you're stretching with a large singular piece. For me, I have a deviated septum and I had a pretty tight sweet spot. I definitely had enough sweet spot to pierce and to stretch, but there wasn't that much going on. I stretched with a pincher to about a 10, maybe an 8 gauge, and I could already feel that I was like real close to that structural cartilage. And if I'm being honest, septum stretching was already not the most comfortable process. I didn't want to deal with it being any more uncomfortable than it already was, and I really liked the look of stacked jewelry. Don't get me wrong, I liked the look of big chunky jewelry too, but if it meant that I was going to have an easier stretching process and not have to deal with denting, and I still really like the look of the stacks, stacking was worth it for me. Again, that's my personal experience, and it's going to be different for everyone. I know a lot of people absolutely adore the look of noses with really big stretched septums. I think they look super dope. That like shape that they get from the side is really adorable. So if that's something that you really like the look of, then stacking's probably not going to be the best choice for you. You're probably going to want to stretch with a singular piece. Now, another element people will ask me about is timelines. For a lot of folks, stretching should be a journey, not a destination, but many of us can get focused on that destination. People want to get a big septum as quickly as they can, and they go, Lynn, what's the fastest way for me to do that? And I'm going to be honest, timelines between both stacking and stretching with round pieces are honestly going to be pretty similar. When we're stretching a septum, we are stretching cartilage, which means it does stretch a lot slower than other areas like our earlobes and things like that. This does mean we're going to have to take more time between stretches. 3 to 5 months is not uncommon. Even longer is not uncommon. That's going to be the case whether you're stacking or stretching with a round piece. When you're stretching with a round piece, you can use half sizes. 0.5 millimeter increment jumps are really helpful. And when you're stacking, a lot of times people are adding 18 gauge rings or 1 millimeter rings at a time, but there are smaller rings that you can get to add to your stack. Or instead of adding a whole new ring, you can swap an 18 gauge ring to a 16 gauge ring or a 14 gauge ring. Keeping the same amount of rings in your stack, but adding a larger one still allows you to stretch. With stacking, this allows us to stretch in like much smaller increments of like 0.2 to 0.4 millimeters at a time, which is really nice. And sometimes that can allow us to seem like we're moving up a little bit quicker. But if you're only stretching 0.2 millimeters at a time and someone with a round piece is stretching 0.5, then you actually end up stretching around the same amount in around the same time frames. And both methods of stretching can deal with slowing down because you got sick, you got a cold, you're dealing with dry skin in the winter, your body is stressed, or your body's just taking extra time to recover from this stretch. So neither round pieces nor stacking have a speed advantage over the other. Both are going to require a lot of time and patience, and again, really try and focus on the journey, not the destination. I know that's hard, but it is really good advice when you're stretching. Now, another factor for some folks is the permanence of stretching. All stretching should always be considered permanent. There's no guarantee that it's going to shrink or go back. But for people for whom that may be a factor later on, I gotta be honest, stacking is going to create a little bit more of a subtle channel in your nose that's going to be a little bit easier to hide should you decide you change your mind and you want to retire this piercing, as opposed to stretching with a large singular piece. Here is a photo example of a friend of mine's septum and my septum. We are both at roughly 0 to 00 gauge. I wear up to 11 1mm rings stacked through my septum, which comes out to like roughly 7/16, but because of how I change it out, my septum's probably closer to being at like a 00 all the time. And his septum is stretched with a singular round piece wearing a silicone eyelet, also at roughly a 00 gauge. And if we look at these pictures of our noses side by side, it kind of makes sense why stacking would be a little bit more forgiving if you needed to retire it down the line than stretching with a singular round piece. There's definitely a lot to consider when it comes down to the decision of how you want to stretch your septum, and a big part of that is that it's not always so easy to transition between methods of stretching. For example, I chose to stack my septum. I've been stacking for a very long time, and even if I decided to take my stack out and switch to a larger piece, while my stack may be at roughly a 00 gauge, I would probably barely be able to fit a 4 or a 6 gauge pincher or circular in there because the shape is just not cross compatible. And likewise, someone may have a 00 round stretch septum, but only be able to wear 3 or 4 rings in a way that lays aesthetically with their nose before the rings start bunching and sitting on top of each other. I will say if you were to switch between the two, it would be a little bit easier to go from a singular round shape to a stacked one than the opposite. However, you'd risk losing a lot of size very rapidly in your round stretch septum as it kind of went down to the shape of the rings. And I've met plenty of people who stretched with a round piece and decided to transition to stacking later and just weren't really happy with how their stacks were sitting because they didn't have that nice narrow coin slot shape. So they didn't sit like nicely in a row. Their rings were always like crisscrossing on top of each other or bunching up at the back of their septum. And they would be like, I just can't get them to lay really nicely all the time the way people who stretch by stacking could. So while there is a little bit of cross compatibility, there's really not that much. So if you have a clear style of jewelry you're looking for, if you have a clear aesthetic you're looking for, or you know you definitely want to avoid things like septum droop or septum denting, or you just definitely prefer the look of those things, I would decide pretty early on in your stretching journey what direction you want to go and stretch with that method. I would say around a 10 or an 8 gauge is a good time to kind of make up your mind and decide if you want to keep going larger with singular pieces or you want to swap it over to a stack and start adding rings every now and again. But it's important to remember that what we choose to do is not 100% permanent. If you do decide to go with the other method of stretching in a couple of years, even a decade or more, you are still able to. You'll have to do a little bit of re-stretching. You may lose some of the size that you gained in the method that you stretched in initially, but you will be able to make that transition with a little bit more time and patience. So it's not like you're completely permanently locked in the method that you choose, but just understand the way that this may affect things. Folks who stretch with round pieces may not have stacks that sit as nicely as folks who stretch by stacking. And folks who stretch by stacking will have a whole journey of stretching ahead of them to transition to round pieces, especially if they want to get as big as their stack was. There's not one right way to stretch your septum, and one of these methods is not inherently better than the other. They're just two different ways to go about doing this that allow you to achieve two different aesthetics, wear two different styles of jewelry, and have two slightly different experiences with the stretching process. But both are awesome, valid, great, and safe ways to stretch your piercing when they're done correctly. I hope kind of weighing out these pros and cons helps you if you're considering stretching your septum or you're already on the journey with deciding what method of stretching works best for you. If you have any further questions about stretching or stacking, please leave them down in the comments below. And again, I do have a guide here on my page and also on my website all about both stretching septums with large pieces and stacking septums to stretch. So all of your technical questions can be found answered in those videos and in those blog posts. As per usual, if you like the content that I put out, please hit like and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and I hope to sit down and chat with you again soon. Bye.